If I'm trying to communicate this concept to everyone, I could go on, spending hundreds of hours displaying this same word in every conceivable language. Or I could show you this. This is the power of a symbol. They are all around us, and they have a profound impact on how we live our lives. Symbols tell us when to cross the street. Symbols tell us when we're pregnant. We can explain any mathematical phenomenon because of symbols.
I think what intrigues me about these things is that they're such condensed things of meaning. The idea is that you have one symbol that communicates so much and also so clearly. It's just like the logo, but now it's more complicated. You have a whole set of these things next to each other, and you all got to communicate things in relation to each other, in relation to their environment. So it makes the challenge a little bit different.
When I walked through airports as a child, I had a strange fascination with the signs that told travelers what to do and where to go. They struck me as strangely balanced and beautiful for things that didn't have to be. It wasn't until a couple of years ago that I actually learned the stories behind these symbols and the people who created them. Not enough people realized that these simple symbols were some of the most meticulously thought out pieces of graphic design in the past 100 years. This story begins around the turn of the century with the advent of maps and public signage systems.
Otto Neurath was like a philosopher and social scientist who is considered the founder of the modern pictogram movement. And in the 1920s, he had these really big ideas that you could educate everybody and create, a more just, egalitarian society if you use pictograms to teach all kinds of concepts. And ultimately, one of the big impacts of his work was the creation of standard symbol sets. It's for transportation and airports and, bathroom signs and all that kind of stuff.
Well, you see that in the 1960s, the first symbol systems are being developed, and it has to do with several factors. You have an internationalization, people could travel easier, they visited other continents, so especially if you have large events like Olympic Games, World Exhibitions, it would be helpful if people can find their way there. So that's one of the reasons why designers started developing symbols. In this day, were probably inspired also by the success of road signs at the time, because this is also the time that people started driving more. More traffic casualties, more interest in the safety of roads, more research into road signs. It proved that you could have symbols used for public space, for public purposes, not for commercial purposes, that could help people, which also appealed to designers. Finally, and that's perhaps the biggest thing, this is also the time of the rise of the visual identity systems. They have these logos that are being used by companies. The attention for this increased tremendously in the 1950s, 1960s. And with that also the idea that you could use these for public purposes. So there you have it. World exhibitions, Olympic Games, and also with that later, trains and aviation companies that started using them.
Definitely a desire to create this visual equivalent for type, kind of like emoji today. That you could represent all the emotions and ideas and philosophies and foods and animals of the world through these pictures.
Many organizations, countries develop their own systems. Air transport associations were developing their independent systems starting in 1965, 1964. Railways was having their own systems. These were not always that well conceived in quality of design or in the theory backing these systems up. You had individual designers designing systems for world exhibitions. So it was quite scattered all around. Not many people were collaborating and designing these things. So if time evolved during the 1960s, early 1970s, people started to worry about the coherence. There was a Tower of Babel coming alive with multiple symbol languages next to each other. And this is also something that were designers. That was more or less the environment in which this happened.
Mm-hmm. I put some things out here is that, there are all kinds of authorities, airport authorities and aviation authorities and airline groups and whatever, both in the US, but also internationally. And there's an international organization called International ICAO. It's the International Civil Aviation Organization. Mm-hmm. And they supposedly set guidelines for airlines and things across the world because obviously they're interchanging all the time. So they had come out with a proposed system of signs and symbols, and they were really horribly designed, look very old-fashioned. Yeah. Very. This was there, no smoking and so on. What happened is that someone at the Department of Transportation in Washington, a guy named Bill Myers, recognized that these were really pretty bad. So he thought somehow we should do better, and he got together all the US aviation organizations and they sort of agreed. So he went to the American Institute of Graphic Arts and the Industrial Designer Society of America. They're the two sort of professional organizations for industrial design and graphic design. And I was then asked by the American Institute of Graphic Arts to be their representative. So we met with a lot of the representatives of these organizations and said we would like to take a completely fresh look at all this.
The committee followed a meticulous, thorough methodology for doing this, and the first step was assembling the team.
And I thought a way to do this was to get together a committee of other designers I really admired, sort of 4 or 5 of us, to look at that, and then for us to determine what should be done, to look at what was being done around the world, and then to find other designers to actually design the marks.
The next step was defining a system and a list of symbols needed. A list of initial message areas was developed by the Department of Transportation along with the AIGA committee, consisting of 4 determined categories.
Still having a relationship to Yale, proposed it to the school and to some of the graduates that they do a study of what's going on around the world. And so they gathered in about over a year examples of what was being done all around the world for these same messages. And one of the first things was, what is it we need to symbolize? And we tried to get them to really narrow it down to the most important ones. And there were like 24 of them, I think, at the beginning. And then what we did is we tried to analyze what was being done around the world, what was good and what was bad about what was being done, and what we should do in terms of a concept for a message. So for example, for telephone, you do, dial phone, which you may have never seen, or do you do a handset of what's now an old-fashioned phone, or what do you do? And we found, for example, that around the world, almost everyone was using the handset. So it seemed to be, if the idea of these is to communicate to people with no training and everything, it should be a handset. Because one of the issues that we recognized as designers is that somehow these things have to be done in a common visual language, which is hard because you have little things and big things and complicated things and simple things. So we tried to determine what should be that message and what should be the image that should be portrayed. Mm-hmm. We then hired two guys who had a small design office, Roger Cook and Don Chanowski, to be the designers of the mark based on the analysis that we had done. And we were all designers. I mean, many were designers, but we thought it'd be an interesting thing. And so they would come back with sketches or ideas or whatever. We'd all sit around and talk about them. And they were really responsible for making sure they all had a common visual language. And they did a very good job of it. And so that was a whole thing, which, we were all doing this sort of in our spare time. So it ended up taking a couple of years to get that done.
They weren't trying to be revolutionary. They were trying to create something that would be very recognizable. The whole alphabet is arbitrary. Mm-hmm. So, I think most of what we communicate with is actually completely abstract. Mm-hmm. And what made these symbols important was that they were trying not to be arbitrary and trying to create something that people would intrinsically understand because they're pictures.
Mm-hmm. But the 60s were a time where a lot of symbols and logos and things were done. And we did a lot of things in that period. And even the government, for a lot of government agencies, were starting to find ways to better visually represent themselves and so on. So it wasn't something out of the blue in that sense, mm-hmm. But I think we were all more conscious of it and what was good and what was not good. And we all recognized that the ones being proposed internationally were not good. Mm-hmm. So we thought to do it, and because we were doing it as part of the American Institute of Graphic Arts, that we would do it and make it, as best we could, make it available to anyone who wanted to use them. And in the long run, we provided published artwork for all of them and files for all of them so that any sign company or anyone who wanted to use it could use it. Yeah. And as a result, they have actually become the standard around the world.